In 2010, the cinematic landscape was rocked by the arrival of Inception. Amidst a Hollywood increasingly crowded with sequels and reboots, Christopher Nolan proved the seemingly impossible, that an original, complex, and deeply philosophical concept could still become a massive, global blockbuster. Grossing over $800 million, Inception wasn't just a commercial triumph. It was a cultural landmark that sparked a decade of debates about the nature of reality and the weight of dreams. However, the flip side of this monumental success was the immense pressure placed on Nolan himself. He spent nearly 10 years refining the screenplay, evolving it from a straightforward horror heist into a high-stakes emotional odyssey. The influence of Inception paved the way for the era of the smart blockbuster, where audiences went to the theater not just for spectacle, but to have their intellect challenged. Nolan famously utilized a $160 million budget to prioritize practical effects, like the iconic rotating hallway, over a total reliance on CGI. This commitment to physical reality is exactly why the film's aesthetic remains timeless. For Leonardo DiCaprio, it was the definitive moment that solidified his status as the premier leading man for high-concept, auteur-driven projects. Inception served as a bold opening statement for the 2000s. Hollywood still had room for genius-level ambition and original storytelling, provided a filmmaker was brave enough to bet on the audience's intelligence. If 2010 was about the smart blockbuster, 2012 was the year the cinematic universe became the industry's new religion. The Avengers was the culmination of a high-stakes gamble that began with Iron Man in 2008. Before this, the idea of crossing over 4 separate franchises into one massive event was considered a logistical nightmare and a potential creative disaster. However, director Joss Whedon managed to strike gold, blending the disparate tones of a Norse god, a World War II super soldier, and a billionaire in a flying suit. The film didn't just break records, it shattered them, grossing over $1.5 billion and proving that the audience's appetite for serialized storytelling was insatiable. The flip side of this success was a seismic shift in how Hollywood functioned. Suddenly, every major studio stopped looking for standalone hits and started hunting for universes. This led to a decade of frantic world-building where movies often felt like 2-hour trailers for the next installment. For the cast, The Avengers was a life-altering event that turned Robert Downey Jr., Chris Evans, and Scarlett Johansson into global icons, but it also locked them into grueling multi-year contracts that dominated their professional lives. By the time the credits rolled on The Avengers, the Marvel formula had been perfected, and the blockbuster landscape was forever altered. It was no longer enough for a movie to be a hit. It had to be a piece of a much larger, multi-billion-dollar puzzle. While Marvel was busy building universes, 2012 also saw the birth of a different kind of titan, the YA dystopian phenomenon. The Hunger Games arrived as a cultural lightning bolt, proving that a female-led action franchise could dominate the global box office just as fiercely as any superhero epic. Based on Suzanne Collins's gritty novels, the film grossed nearly $700 million and struck a chord with a generation feeling the anxieties of a fractured society. However, the flip side of this massive success was the sudden, almost violent ascent of Jennifer Lawrence. At just 21, she was thrust into a level of scrutiny that few humans are prepared for, becoming the face of a multi-billion-dollar machine while trying to maintain her own identity. The film's impact went far beyond its box office numbers. It sparked a gold rush in Hollywood for the next young adult hit, leading to a decade of dystopian clones that often struggled to capture the same magic. Director Gary Ross chose a shaky cam, visceral aesthetic that made the violence feel uncomfortably real, grounding the high-concept premise in a raw, human struggle. For Lawrence, Katniss Everdeen was the role that made her an Oscar-winning powerhouse, but it also came with the heavy burden of being a role model for millions. The Hunger Games proved that audiences were hungry for stories with political weight and complex female protagonists, shifting the blockbuster lens toward a more diverse and socially conscious perspective that would define the rest of the 2000s and 10s. In 2013, Walt Disney Animation Studios achieved something it hadn't seen since the Renaissance of the early 90s, a total global takeover. Frozen wasn't just a hit movie, it was a multi-billion-dollar cultural explosion that redefined the Disney princess brand for a modern audience. Grossing over $1.2 billion, it subverted decades of fairy tale tropes by centering the narrative on the bond between two sisters, Elsa and Anna, rather than a romantic rescue by a prince. The flip side of this massive success was the Let It Go phenomenon, a song so ubiquitous that it became both a generational anthem and a point of exhaustion for parents worldwide. Directors Chris Buck and Jennifer Lee had tapped into a primal theme of self-acceptance that resonated across every demographic. The impact of Frozen forced Hollywood to realize that the female audience was a monolithic force capable of driving record-breaking merchandising and box office returns. Disney shifted its entire strategy toward these modern narratives, moving away from passive heroines toward proactive, complex female leads. For the voice cast, particularly Idina Menzel and Kristen Bell, the film provided a level of immortality that few live-action roles could offer. However, the pressure to replicate this lightning-in-a-bottle success led to years of development on sequels and spin-offs as Disney sought to maintain the Frozen fever. By the time the decade moved forward, Frozen had proved that a simple story about sisterhood could be more powerful than any explosion-filled blockbuster, forever changing the DNA of family entertainment. By 2014, the Marvel Cinematic Universe was no longer a gamble. It was a juggernaut. However, Guardians of the Galaxy represented the studio's most daring stress test to date. Director James Gunn was handed a group of obscure C-list comic book characters, including a talking raccoon and a sentient tree, and tasked with making them global icons. The film's massive $773 million success proved the flip side of the industry's logic. The Marvel brand had become more powerful than the intellectual property itself. Audiences weren't showing up for the characters they knew. They were showing up because they trusted the studio's ability to deliver a specific, high-quality experience. This shift was a turning point for Hollywood's casting and marketing strategies. Chris Pratt, previously known as the lovable goofball on Parks and Recreation, underwent a radical physical transformation to become a bona fide action star, signaling a new era where personality and comedic timing were as valued as traditional leading man looks. The film's Awesome Mix soundtrack also revolutionized the use of nostalgia in blockbusters. proving that a curated 70s pop aesthetic could sell millions of records and define a movie's identity. However, the immense success of Guardians also created a trend of quippy dialogue and mandatory humor in big-budget films that some critics argued began to dilute the stakes of the genre. Ultimately, James Gunn's space opera showed that with enough style and heart, even the strangest misfits could rule the world. In 2015, Hollywood proved that nostalgia was the most powerful weapon in its arsenal with the release of Jurassic World. After a 14-year slumber, the dinosaur franchise didn't just return, it exploded, grossing over $1.6 billion and briefly becoming the third highest-grossing film of all time. The film's success was a masterclass in legacy sequel marketing, blending the wonder of Steven Spielberg's original 1993 masterpiece with modern, high-octane spectacle. Chris Pratt solidified his A-list status here, trading his Guardian's wit for the rugged intensity of an animal behaviorist. However, the flip side of this massive financial win was a growing critique from purists who felt the film prioritized bigger, louder, more teeth over the tension and scientific awe that made the original a classic. Director Colin Trevorrow's vision shifted the blockbuster landscape toward a trend of revitalization that would dominate the late 2000s. Studios realized that audiences weren't just hungry for new stories. They wanted to return to the worlds they loved as children, provided the scale was exponentially larger. This led to an era of hybrid casting, where new stars like Bryce Dallas Howard shared the screen with legacy icons to bridge the generational gap. While Jurassic World faced some backlash for its use of CGI dinosaurs compared to the animatronic soul of the 90s, its box office dominance was undeniable. It proved that if you could successfully repackage childhood wonder for a global modern audience, the financial ceiling for a blockbuster was practically non-existent. If 2015 was the year of nostalgia, then Star Wars: The Force Awakens was its ultimate crowning achievement. After a decade-long hiatus following the prequel trilogy, J.J. Abrams was tasked with the most high-pressure resurrection in cinematic history. The film didn't just meet expectations, it obliterated them, grossing over $2 billion and becoming a global cultural phenomenon that bridged 3 generations of fans. By bringing back original icons like Harrison Ford and Carrie Fisher, alongside a diverse new cast including Daisy Ridley and John Boyega, the film successfully passed the torch. However, the flip side of this massive triumph was the impossible weight of fan entitlement and the creative struggle to balance fan service with genuine innovation. The production of The Force Awakens was a masterclass in modern mystery box marketing, but it also highlighted the extreme physical and emotional toll on its stars. Harrison Ford famously suffered a broken leg on set, and the new, relatively unknown leads were suddenly thrust into a level of scrutiny that made privacy a thing of the past. For the industry, this film proved that the Star Wars brand was still the most potent force in entertainment, leading Disney to announce a rapid-fire schedule of sequels and spin-offs. While critics debated whether the plot was too similar to the 1977 original, audiences didn't care. They wanted the comfort of the Millennium Falcon and the hum of a lightsaber. The Force Awakens remains the definitive example of how Hollywood can turn a collective memory into a multi-billion-dollar reality. In 2018, the landscape of the modern blockbuster was fundamentally reshaped by Black Panther. While Marvel was already the dominant force in Hollywood, Ryan Coogler's masterpiece proved that a superhero film could be a profound cultural landmark and a sophisticated political drama. Grossing over $1.3 billion, it shattered the long-standing biased industry myth that films with a predominantly black cast could not perform in international markets. The late Chadwick Boseman delivered a regal, nuanced performance as T'Challa, but it was the flip side of the antagonist, Michael B. Jordan's Eric Killmonger, that truly elevated the film. For the first time, a blockbuster villain had a motivation so grounded in real-world history and pain that audiences found themselves questioning the hero's perspective. The impact of Black Panther was a seismic shift for representation in global cinema. It wasn't just a movie, it was a movement celebrated for its Afrofuturism aesthetic and its celebration of African culture, costume design, and music. The film became the first superhero movie to be nominated for the Academy Award for Best Picture, signaling to the world that the genre film had finally earned the prestige of high art. For the cast, including Lupita Nyong'o and Danai Gurira, the film provided a platform to redefine the image of the female warrior on screen. Black Panther proved that the most massive blockbusters are those that reflect the diversity of the world we live in, turning a comic book adaptation into a global symbol of pride and excellence. By 2019, the superhero fatigue that critics had predicted for years finally met its match in Todd Phillips's Joker. This was the ultimate counter-blockbuster, a gritty R-rated character study that traded cosmic battles for the decaying streets of 1980s Gotham. Grossing over $1 billion, it became the highest-grossing R-rated film of all time, proving that the flip side of the genre's dominance was an audience hungry for something dangerous, grounded, and deeply uncomfortable. Joaquin Phoenix's transformative, Oscar-winning performance as Arthur Fleck wasn't just acting, it was a visceral descent into madness that challenged the very idea of what a comic book movie could be. The impact of Joker sent shockwaves through Hollywood's executive suites. It proved that you didn't need a $200 million budget or a team of CGI artists to create a global phenomenon. Sometimes, all you needed was a controversial script and a fearless lead actor. However, the film's success came with intense media scrutiny and concerns over its depiction of mental health and social isolation. For the industry, Joker opened the door for prestige genre films, allowing directors to take bigger risks with iconic IP. It remains a definitive moment of the late 2000s and 10s, a blockbuster that felt like an indie film, a tragedy that performed like a summer hit, and a mirror held up to a society on the brink of collapse. The decade reached its inevitable, earth-shaking climax with Avengers: Endgame in 2019. This wasn't just a movie, it was a global secular holiday, the grand finale of a 22-film journey that had redefined the very nature of cinema. Grossing a staggering $2.79 billion, it briefly became the highest-grossing film in history, proving that serialized storytelling on a grand scale was the most successful business model in the history of art. Directors Anthony and Joe Russo managed to weave together a decade of character arcs into a 3-hour epic that felt both massive and deeply personal. The flip side of this achievement was the sheer scale of the production, a logistical miracle that required thousands of crew members, and a budget that touched nearly $400 million. For the stars, particularly Robert Downey Jr. and Chris Evans, Endgame was the emotional final bow that cemented their legacies as the defining icons of a generation. The film's cultural footprint was so large that it felt like the end of an era, a moment where the theatrical experience reached its absolute zenith before the world changed in 2020. Endgame proved that if you spend a decade building a relationship with your audience, they will follow you to the ends of the universe. It was the perfect bookend to the 2000s, a decade that began with the intellectual dreams of Inception and ended with the assembly of every hero we had come to love, leaving a legacy that Hollywood will be trying to replicate for decades to come.